My guest this week is Peter Vaughan, a self-confessed bird nerd and pelagic tragic. Peter did his honours on Gadfly Petrels, one of the fast-flying pelagic birds you might see on a pelagic trip. Peter is also a keen photographer and tour guide and regularly leads tours around Tasmania and other parts of Australia for tour companies like Inala. Peter's twitching team, the Bird Nerds, also won the BirdLife Twitchathon and the BirdLife Tasmania shortened version of the same. If there's anything you need to know about pelagic birding or what to expect on a pelagic trip, this is the podcast for you. I hope you enjoyed listening to Peter Vaughan give us all the ins and outs from that deep water zone off the continental shelf and how to identify those birds while you're out there. As with all other guests, Peter selected 5 songs that have a special place in his life and talks about his reasons for selecting them. Welcome, Peter. It's wonderful for you to take the time out of your hectic schedule to stop and give us a few minutes of your time to go over a bit of you and a bit of your birding life.
No worries at all. Thanks very much for having me on.
And before we get started, congratulations on your honours, by the way, and also receiving, was it the Tasmanian University Award?
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I finished my honours at the end of 2019 and did sufficiently academically well, at least. It was a university medal, so that is essentially just a UTAS. Top of honours and done well in the degree at the same time type of award. So it was nice to get, and particularly having used pelagic data for seabirds, it was nice to actually make something out of that.
Fantastic, yeah. You did your honours on Gadfly Petrels. And for the people listening, what are Gadfly Petrels?
Gadfly petrels are a type of tube-nosed seabird. So they're seated within, there's a broad group of familiar birds like albatross and shearwaters, and they're really highly specialised, deep oceanic foragers, really well adapted for what's called dynamic soaring. So the characteristic flight pattern, the arcing and wheeling of albatrosses and shearwaters, Gadfly petrels have really perfected that over an evolutionary timescale.
Wow, and by name, I mean, Gadfly means fast flying, so presumably they dart around a bit faster than, say, the larger albatross and things like that, but does it make them harder to study or observe?
It makes them a lot harder to observe at sea. They're relatively small, and because they're fast moving and lots of them look quite similar to each other, it makes it quite difficult to pick out the little things to tell which species is which. And then if you then want to get a camera on them at the same time on a moving boat, it adds a quantum level of difficulty to the whole equation. But it's amazing what they can achieve. Over 500 kilometres in a single day by soaring up and down, almost completely passively. They can move huge distances.
Amazing. And what was it in particular you were studying about them, Peter?
So I was looking at essentially how they respond to their environment on a micro scale. And there's difficulty in doing that studying seabirds full stop, because obviously you have to be at least out on a boat or out on some island colony somewhere attaching trackers to seabirds to know where they are in space, and then know what parameters of the environment or prey availability and so forth that you need to be examining to determine what they're responding to in order to move around and forage successfully and so forth and so forth. So what I ended up looking at based off the pelagic data were a set of environmental variables and how the resident gadfly petrels we see off southeastern Australia actually respond to changes in those parameters. So there were things like sea surface temperature, which is a really widely used proxy for productivity, looked at chlorophyll emissions from satellite images, which again just shows how much energy production is going on in the ocean for higher trophic levels to take advantage of. And then some things like current direction, wind speed and direction, which are more determining how wave action and wind action are influencing the specific movement of the birds.
Wow. Sounds like a very in-depth study. And how long was your study period that you worked over?
The actual time that I spent working on it was relatively constrained. It was only a 10-month honours project. But the data set that I was drawing off was one that's curated by one of my supervisors, Rowan Clark at Monash University. And he's done some fantastic work compiling pelagic data from around southeastern Australia that goes back to the 1980s. So there was bird data collection for that whole time. And because I was using remotely sensed environmental data, there are different points where that comes in along the time frame, and sea surface temperature could perhaps be sensed earlier than something like current direction from satellite images and so forth. So it ended up being the early 2000s where I had a complete data set of all the variables that I was looking at to work with.
Okay. You're based in Tassie, so did most of your research findings come from work that had been done off the Tasmanian coast, or was it Australia-wide?
It was primarily, there was roughly an equal number of pelagic trips that we drew off in the end between Tasmania and an area called the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Victoria and over in South Australia, the Port Macdonald pelagics, or visit that Bonnie Upwelling area. So we ended up with about 260 pelagic trips from each of those two to work with.
Okay. And how far offshore are we talking?
We end up getting about 20 kilometres offshore on these boat trips. And because one of the big things with pelagics and using their data for things like environmental correlation, which is what we were doing, the boat's burly in order to attract the birds in, and because they're multi-purpose trips, they're not just scientific survey voyages. So there's burly attracting the birds in, and they have a really wide attraction radius. Going back to the fact Gadfly Petrels are tube noses, they have a fantastic sense of smell, one of the best adapted sense of smells in the animal kingdom. And so when you're burleying, they can be drawn in from up to 40 miles away, nautical miles away. And so we were sampling, the birds were all from about 20 kilometres offshore where the boats were, but we took our environmental variables over a much wider envelope in order to get a representation of where the birds might actually be when they deviated course to come and have a look at the boat.
So yeah, quite a large sample area then. And you obviously went out yourself on a number of these research trips, or the pelagic trips.
Yep. I had been on quite a fair few before the honours even started, and purely for bird watching and out of interest in seabirds. But when it came to doing field work as part of the requirements for the honours project, I had a look at it and thought, well, it would be such a terrible trial to have to go out on pelagics for work too. And over that length of time, I ended up going on 37.
Wow. So you obviously don't get seasick, or do you just take precautions before you go?
You know what? I get terribly seasick. I'm from a relatively seafaring family, but my mum's on the other side. She gets seasick and I get dreadfully, dreadfully seasick. But I take medication beforehand, and it's pretty strong stuff. It's stuff called 𝗪𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏, which is normally used for chemotherapy, anti-nausea.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's relatively serious stuff, and that's just enough to get me through. I can still feel green, but I haven't yet thrown up on the boat.
Wow. And I mean, like we were chatting before came on air, that, you know, it can be a really long day out there when you are feeling a bit under the weather. But how long is a typical trip that if you do get sick, you've just got to go, oh, I'm going to be here for what, 6 hours, 8 hours, or what?
It varies a bit depending where you go around Australia, and I can't speak for most pelagics because I'm lamentably inexperienced at sea off the rest of Australia. But off Eaglehawk, we start at 7 in the morning and get back about 3 in the afternoon. And that's 2 hours each way out to the continental shelf, and the rest of the time out there as far away from land as you can get, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, when it's windy or rainy or there's spray coming into the boat and you're laid out feeling crook, it's a really long day.
Oh, I bet. I must admit, I'm touch wood. I'm pretty good. I don't get seasick, but I suppose it all depends what I've eaten or drank the night before, maybe.
You're a lucky man. Don't push your luck.
That's right. I was looking for wood all over the place. I think I got some. Now, it might be a bit of a silly question, but are gadfly petrels your favourite group of birds, or just your favourite seabirds, or is it just something that was interesting to study?
Very good question. Yeah, I'll pay that. As a favourite group of birds, I reckon gadfly petrels is a pretty good bet. Like, I'm still going out on pelagics even now, having seen probably most of the ones I'm likely to see off southeastern Australia now, and I can't get enough of them. There's some other candidates maybe for favourite bird, but those are long stories.
Okay. Oh, we might chat about those a little bit later. Okay, well, we're going to listen to your first song now, and it probably ties into the, I suppose, the not seasick and seasick bit, but Comfortably Numb. I mean, like Pink Floyd, Comfortably Numb. Great song. Why did you choose it?
I mean, it does seem like a thematically appropriate segue, really. It's a song that I was first introduced to by my dad when we were traveling around Europe and driving what seemed at the time like long distances in the car. And you plug an album in and away you go. And it caught my attention then, but particularly was it a relatively difficult, I suppose, time of life. I'd lost a couple of people who were quite significant in my life, and I kept coming back to it as so something that I could lie back and listen to and think about the world and where it was all headed, and it's retained that significance since then.
Okay, cool. Well, before the song, we were talking about going out on boats and sort of experiencing the pelagic environment. But having been out on a few boats, I marvel at the ability of people like yourself at being able to identify birds on the horizon as they're just sort of coming into sight. Seems to give you enough time to nail down what group it belongs to at least. But can you talk me through your process of, you've seen a bird or a speck on the horizon, it's just coming into sight. What's your mental process then for narrowing it down into what it actually is, or what could it be?
God, I mean, you surely flatter me. There are plenty of people who likewise I look at in complete awe. I don't know how they do it. But the first thing that I start with is usually, even before getting out on the boat in the first place, having a fairly solid idea of what's going to be about at the location, which for me is relatively easy because I'm only ever going out off Eaglehawk Neck. But the location, and then at that time of year as well. And you usually find that pretty rapidly you're down to maybe 4 or 5 birds from any given group that are likely, with a couple of outliers that are rarities to the area or a vagrant that's been seen once or twice. From that point, it's then very much that general impression of its shape, its size, a bit of flight pattern that plays into the whole thing, and the sort of build of the bird to work out what group it slots into. I have a relatively, maybe it's a bit OCD, but a hierarchical approach with albatrosses, petrels, shearwaters, prions, and so forth. It's not strictly taxonomically partitioned, but each of those groups then falls into a couple of nicer groups. Like albatrosses, you have your great albatross, things like wanderers and royals, and mollymawks, which are a bit smaller. So then you've got a smaller group again to work with. And then from there, it's things, the sort of primary order features, stuff you can actually see on a bird that might be the pattern or a particularly distinctive morphological feature, like, say, a giant petrel has a really humped back compared to anything that it could potentially be confused for. And so it's really taking it from higher level down to lower level on a couple of different planes of types of birds that something could be, and then what you can actually see those birds doing or what they look like.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned the word type there. When I've been out on boats, I hear people refer to like a shy type albatross. What's the relevance of that?
That's another level again, which really does start getting into the taxonomy of seabirds, which is a really vexed and complicated field that often results in one bird, a bird that's been considered a species being split into several different species or two groups lumped together, as is often done with birds generally. But when particularly there's a bird that's either a candidate to be split, so there's one species with several races or subspecies, or it is a recent split, so it's recently gone through that process. If one of that group is flying past the boat and you're not quite sure which one it is, and you don't want to call it wrong, it's safe to just call it, it's say a shy type albatross, rather than go for white-capped versus shy albatross or salvins or a Chatham albatross, for example.
Okay. And obviously there's a different like age of birds that you're going to see out there as well. Do they vary markedly that it makes identification confusing, or the wear on the plumage and things like that, it could really make it tricky?
Oh, absolutely. Some do, some don't. Things like the Gadfly Petrels are pretty straightforward. There's not much in the way of juvenile, then immature, and then adult plumages to get through. They really just look like the nice illustrations or photos you'll see in the field guide. Shy albatross and shy type albatrosses are actually a really good case for the opposite, where the juveniles, then immatures, then adults differ substantially, and they differ both within the species and between species. Say a shy albatross, the adults have a white head with a yellow bill, but the juveniles, particularly fresh juveniles, have a nice dark-ish grey head and a grey bill, and that looks really similar to a juvenile Salvin's albatross and closer to an adult Salvin's albatross than looks an adult shy albatross. And so then you start looking at, okay, what age is the bird by, say, comparing the extent of the primary molt, which feathers are growing in at what time of year, to infer what time the bird was born and therefore what plumage condition it should be in now compared to that confusion species that plumage, say that molt stage, should be later or earlier in the year.
Okay. And timing, as far as timing, obviously, in addition to timing of plumage patterns and amount of wear, are certain birds going to turn up at different times of the year as far as species, or a juvenile that's just fledged or something? You're not obviously going to see it while breeding is in its height, but once the nesting period's over, then you're more likely to see those aged birds?
Yep, definitely. So a prime example would be something like shearwaters. The short-tailed shearwaters have fantastically long migration they breed around Tassie and southeastern Australia, forage in the Antarctic while they do so, and then head up to the Bering Sea for our winter. And so they're only here during the warmer months for us. Going on things like plumage, a more detailed example would be the comparison between a white-capped and a shy albatross. The shy albatross breed locally on a few offshore islands and rocks around Tassie. And when we're out, we virtually assume that most of the birds we see are that shy albatross. White-capped looks identical, but breeds in New Zealand and is a candidate to be split. And tracking data show that they do come pretty frequently into Tasmanian waters and Eastern Australian waters, and in fact may be more likely seen in some locations around Australia than shies. When the juveniles fledge, they fledge at different times of year, so breeding's slightly staggered, and the Tassie shies fledge slightly earlier than the whitecaps do. So if you see a fresh juvenile with a really nice dark hood, shy albatross off Australia, it'll be around about, when is it? I forget off the top of my head. It's sort of June, August. And they look really clean and dark then, but they wear quite quickly and become white in the face. Just after that, the whitecaps fledge. And so from sort of September through that time, if you're seeing one with a shy type with a clean, dark-looking head, a juvenile, that's actually going to be a whitecapped. And it's one of those cases where you can actually use plumage timing to tease out a really otherwise impossible, on current knowledge, confusion.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. And I know you talk about like what you expect to see at certain times of year, but there's always going to be some rarities turn up, isn't there? I think I read somewhere you got a sooty albatross on one of your Tasmanian pelagics, which are very much uncommon in that area. So does it happen? I mean, the definition of the word rarity means it doesn't happen very often. But of different birds, do you often get surprised, or is it you have to be out there 50 times to get something really great?
I mean, putting my philosophical hat on, it depends what you define as really great. But
Yeah.
for listing, it really depends, on how many pelagics you've done as to your chance of getting something either new for a list or mind-blowingly rare. See, very rarely we'll get things like there was in January 2018, there was a Juan Fernandez petrel off Eaglehawk Neck, a trip I should have been on and I missed it.
Oh, really?
And that's the sort of thing you just never expect. It's a one in however many trips have been off Eaglehawk Neck and counting. You just wouldn't expect it. But then a bird like a sooty albatross, we don't in fact see them every year. But if you were looking to add sooty albatross to your Australia list, you could look at, say, the frequency distribution of when they occur and go, they're more likely in the colder months of the year. If I do a few more trips at that time, I've got myself a chance.
Mm-hmm. Increasing your chance by going at the right time. Like, for instance, if you want to see a 𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏, you want to go out between, I don't know, November and January sort of thing, when they're probably most prevalent in the water.
Precisely. It's all about where and when they're moving.
Okay, terrific. Okay, Peter, we'll listen to your second song now, Far Above the Clouds by Mike Oldfield. Can you tell us a bit about this one?
Well, it's worth prefacing this song with the fact it is actually two parts, and I didn't want to try and sneak two songs past you. And this second part really does contain the best of the substance of it, in my opinion. This is just my favourite song of all time.
For people that haven't been on a pelagic trip, we touched on, you go out to the continental shelf about 20 odd kilometres offshore. You're out there for about 6 or 7 hours maybe. But what about the actual experience itself? What can people expect from a pelagic trip? What goes on?
Well, it's generally speaking, at least if you come down to Eaglehawk, you hop on the boat off the jetty at 7 and mosey down past, usually we go past a rock called the 𝗙𝗵𝗄𝗏 on the way out, which is a breeding colony for gannets, black-faced cormorants, and there's small numbers of things like common diving petrels. And so we have a quick, almost sightseeing look around there and then cut out the shelf. It always seems like a lot longer than an hour for each of those legs. Once you're out there, it would drop off, usually start burling over about 250 fathoms or so. So the shelf breaks pretty steep and start burling. So that's fish frames, a few chicken skins that float on the water, maybe some tuna oil, things like that in the mix as well, and plug that over the back of the boat to set up a bit of a slick. And that's what actually attracts the seabirds in to have a closer look. And if it's a bit rougher, we'll do the same thing, but the boat just keeps idling around so that we don't get caught dead in the water. And you then basically stay like that until about 1 in the afternoon. It's round about 4 hours give or take out there. And during that time, I'm always desperately straining my eyes into the distance for anything that might try and sneak past. But down off Eaglehawk, you can usually expect, I'll qualify that, usually have good numbers of things like albatrosses, shearwaters at the right time of year, storm petrels, maybe even some prions right up around the boat and doing close passes, or even things like the albatrosses will sit on the water immediately next to the boat and feed for much of the day. And you get amazing views and photos. It's like you're surrounded by, at times, this cloud of different seabirds. And it's just, it's the most mind-blowing experience every time. But the reason I say usually is every now and again you'll have a quieter day, and some of those you're really, really looking out for anything that might go past. An albatross just flew past. Did anyone get to see that?
Right, okay.
It can vary quite spectacularly, but the usual is at least a few albatross and a few other birds coming nice and close, and you get some pretty amazing views.
Terrific. I did read something. I'm not a scientist. I haven't really studied seabirds and the feeding behaviours and things like that. But I read about the diel vertical migration of prey within the ocean and how it moves vertically up at different times of the day. And obviously, albatrosses and other seabirds, I guess, would feed more actively at different times. Is that something that you are familiar with?
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff going on with that. And it seems counterintuitive to us because obviously most of the time, unless you're on a dedicated research voyage, you're out there during the day looking for birds. And so we have this initial inbuilt perception of seabirds as broadly diurnal. And even when you are out at night, spotlighting for seabirds is a pretty challenging undertaking at the best of times. But in fact, because what you're talking about with that diel pattern, a lot of deeper sea fish and cephalopods and crustaceans come up to the surface when it's darker, thinking about how light penetrates through the water column and it gets dark, really not too far below the surface. That band rises as night falls, and so those are brought up close to the surface. And a lot of seabirds are in fact just as happy foraging at night as they are during the day. And so it's difficult to say because there aren't many studies actually reporting on patterns across a circadian cycle for seabird foraging activity. But intuitively knowing what their diet is and what studies are out there talking about the fact that seabirds are equally nocturnal foragers, there has to be a fair lick of variation in what does happen out there.
Mm. Okay, well, before we listen to your next song, actually a good segue into the next song is I was going to chat to you about bird songs and obviously the connection, like on pelagics, you're relying on this 𝗬𝗂𝗵𝗵 or chum to attract the seabirds in, because you don't have the opportunity to play calls to attract birds like we would with songbirds on the land. But as far as obviously attracting seabirds and other pelagic species with 𝗬𝗂𝗵𝗵 and attracting birds, songbirds on land with calls, does it disrupt their natural behaviours at all?
There aren't, in fact, that many studies. There's not a huge amount of research into seabird attraction to 𝗬𝗂𝗵𝗵. There is a fair bit on seabird attraction to fishing vessels, which is essentially the same concept. And it does seem that fishing vessels are highly attractive to seabirds. They'll deviate extremely long distances in order to examine, track, follow, and forage at fishing vessels. And obviously then where trawlers are fishing, there's corollary effects. It's one of the biggest threats that seabirds face, is being entangled in fishery gear and caught on long line hooks and so forth. So it does certainly, even burleying on a pelagic certainly influences their behavior and changes what they're doing or what they would be doing naturally if we weren't out there burleying for them. But the flip side to that is what they would be doing is flying around looking for an attractive food source to go and forage at. And we just happen to be that food source. So it's a little bit different, I think, to something like, and this is personal opinion completely, but something like using call playback on passerines, because they're responding either inquisitively or agonistically to a potential rival or a mate or whatever it might be, whereas the seabirds are just responding to a food source. It is more akin to leaving out bait like mealworms for bird photography and waiting for what comes in. It's altering how they behave, but it's not causing an undue risk to either populations or individual birds' well-beings by being out there and undertaking those activities to have a look at them or to study them.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we will listen to your third song now, Peter, which is Like a Song by U2. Can you tell us about this one?
Well, this is a complete non sequitur from anything to do with birding, I'd have to say. This comes from a little known fact is that I'm a keen exponent of karate and have been for about 15 years. And I first listened to this song when we had these week-long training boot camps and would be up really early in the morning. Dad would drop me off on his way to work and we'd be listening to the music he had on in the car. And this ended up being the song that I'd get sort of pumped up to and ready to go for 6 in the morning to 8 at night days karate training.
Now, Peter, you're a self-confessed bird nerd. When did you start getting an interest in birds?
I mean, I think it would be a fairly generic opening line to say I've been interested in natural history since as early as I can remember, sat watching the David Attenborough documentaries, funnily enough, Blue Planet with the seabird connection, on the old VHS, way back when, rewinding it and watching it all over again immediately. But birds really became a thing for me specifically when it was in 2005. My parents took my siblings and I out of school for a year and we travelled around Australia and ended up going up across the south coast up through the Red Centre into the Kimberley and then back down through Cloncurry and down the east coast. And we'd got a bird book, the old the 2005 edition of 𝗙𝗵𝗄𝗃 and 𝗏 to read along the way, just as one of the things you do as you're starting off homeschooling and learning as you go on a long road trip like that. And we were seeing all of these birds that I'd never seen before, and I could flip through the book and cross-reference the picture of that spectacularly colourful, almost impossible-looking bird with what I was actually seeing right then and there or had seen that day. And that was just the spark that lit the flame that built and built from that point.
Well, and you've kept a list, I'm presuming, of all the birds you've seen along the way. Can I ask what you're up to? Do you have that info?
Oh, I embarrassingly, for someone who would call himself a twitcher, I don't actually have the number off the top of my head. In Australia, it's somewhere around the 630, 640 mark. It's in that ballpark. At the moment, I'm a lot more serious about my Tasmania list, and I'm on 255 for that at the moment.
And I know that you've participated in the BirdLife Twitchathon and the Tasmanian Twitchathon and actually done very well at them in recent years. I think you're your team's called the Bird Nerds, isn't it? And you've carried it off a couple of... Yeah.
Tragically.
Is it easier to see birds in Tasmania, which makes it easier for you to compete in things like twitchathons? Is it because it's, so many environments in such a confined space, or how does it work as far as your ability to see as many birds as possible in a twitchathon?
It's an interesting trade-off because Tasmania does have a decent number of environments and it is a small area. You can drive to anywhere in Tassie and back from Hobart in a day quite comfortably. But the problem with being a little island in the cold off the southern part of a larger continent is we have much lower relative species richness even than areas of southern coast Victoria, as a baseline example. And yeah, it's taking the whole of Victoria into account, so it's not quite equivalent. A good Tassie list after a few years birding is 200,
Right.
and the same for Victoria's around high 300s, even 400. So it's an approximation, but it's about half the number of birds to see. So you can get around everywhere really easily, but you have a lot fewer birds to see. So it ends up probably pretty much evening out. And the way the twitchathons run through BirdLife the last few years before it got canned with COVID in 2020 was that there's a correction factor, if you will, which is roughly what percentage of species did you see out of the possible species in your state. And so that's really how the bird nerds have ended up doing well at all. Our species list in no way comes close to comparing to the other states or teams in other states. But because we could get the whole way around Tassie, you get a decently high percentage. That's really the secret to being a high achieving twitchathon team in Tasmania.
Right. Okay. And do you get bonus points and things like that for seeing, I suppose, critically endangered species?
I wish you did, because we've got a few decent candidates down here.
That's
but
what I was thinking.
Unfortunately, one bird is as good as the next, and it's nice in a way because for just the first 2 minutes of a twitchathon, a starling is just as good as an orange-bellied parrot.
Right.
But the novelty wears off very quickly.
I'll bet. And I listened to it was an audio recording I found somewhere on the internet, but you and a couple of other people were challenged to see how many birds you could see or hear or identify
you found this.
in the 10 minutes in the ABC car park.
Oh, grief. Oh, no.
But I didn't get to the end, but I do remember like the first bird I think was a starling or it was a sparrow, I think, from memory. But
Yeah, we ended up setting some new ABC car park rules and counted the domestic chickens that they keep on site. There's some ongoing show they have going on with domestic chickens, so we altered the rules slightly to count them too. But one of the radio hosts down here for ABC Mornings, Leon, is interested in birds and has really got on board with the Twitchathon. It's been great fun working with him for the last couple of years. But he set Andy, my partner, and I, who are currently the bird nerds, the challenge of seeing as many species as we could in 10 minutes in the ABC car park in central Hobart. I think, to memory, we ended up with 10, not counting the chicken. Okay. So the official tally's 11. But it devolved from spotting birds into pishing for birds, which was dreadfully embarrassing to then be contacted about from statewide radio after the fact.
Now, talking about your activities, we'll get away from the pelagics a little bit, but I know you do a lot of bird guiding work for Inala especially, but other groups as well, I think. How do you decide where to take people? I mean, obviously, you're not going to take them to the ABC car park to pick up a 𝗙𝗓𝗃𝗃 or something. But how do you know where to go? I mean, obviously experience tells you. You've done a lot of research, you're very experienced in your field, but say, for instance, I want to go and see, the 12 Tassie endemics. Where would you take me?
If it was the 12 Tassie endemics, it'd be Bruny Island straight away, all in a nice, convenient little package. And it's really your only solid chance at the moment for 𝗊𝗂𝗶𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 I would normally work out where to go is based on the species list. So right there, you've got yourself a species list of 12 targets. What areas do you need to go to get those? And that's just having done a fair bit of bird watching around Tassie in the last few years and built up a repertoire of reliable sites that you can pick and choose from. Okay, you want to see say a scrub tit. I know a patch of forest that's got those and we'll have a go at them. Other than that, there are sometimes sort of pre-organized tours, and I know you're artfully trying to direct me away from pelagics, but I'm doing my best to rectify the situation. There's a seabirds, a shorebirds and seabirds tour that I'm running this year with a few different dates, with an Eaglehawk pelagic tucked in, and that's a sort of package offering. This is where we're going, and these are the birds we might see. If you're interested, here's the link to join the tour. So there's a couple of different strategies for getting those set up. And when you're trying to do one of those sort of pre-arranged package tours, if you will, of here's a species set, you're trying to pick something that people are going to find interesting. And seabirds is a pretty good bet for that one.
Now, I know you're on the committee of BirdLife Tassie. Just for the people listening, what sort of work do BirdLife do in general, or specifically Tassie, I suppose, from your perspective, but in general?
In general, it's a lot of advocacy and research work for science and conservation, particularly looking at development proposals and a decent focus on seabirds and shorebirds again. There's a fair bit being done with the bird data portal in Tasmania and summarising long-term rigorous data sets to determine trends in Tassie bush birds.
You mentioned citizen science a bit earlier, and I know it's a bit of a buzz phrase going around in the last few years, but how can people get involved? Can they report unusual sightings, or is there a portal that they can upload or someone they can get in touch with to say, I've just seen this rare bird, like a swift parrot or something?
Oh, absolutely. Australia-wide, there are a lot of the current bird watching community seems to be situated on Facebook, and most of the rarities that get reported quickly and instantaneously tend to be on Facebook forums. But there are some actual reporting platforms like Birdline is the one that immediately springs to mind for Australia-wide, where anywhere you are, you can submit a sighting for that area. It's such and such. Here's some added details. Here's a photo, and up it goes, and people can see it. And it ultimately, at least in Tassie, I don't know about the rest of Australia, but in Tassie it then gets added by one particularly dedicated volunteer into the eBird database. I don't know if you've come across eBird, and bird data is a related thing, because more generally speaking, that's good for reporting rarities. But if you're interested in contributing observations for more general projects, or even just to keep track of the things you're seeing for yourself, eBird is the #1 citizen science platform. I'd go on a limb and say in the world at the moment. It's bird specific, hence the name.
Yep.
But anyone, it's completely free. You can get yourself an account and then just either on your computer or on your phone submit lists of birds you see wherever you are. So I submit lists for 𝗬𝗂𝗃𝗃 or home or wherever it might be. That's a really, really good project for people to get involved in. And it's fun to follow too. You see some amazing sightings and photos and all sorts of things.
Terrific. Yeah, we'll definitely get people involved. And yeah, if you're listening and you want to get involved,
citizen science is the way of the future.
Yes. Yeah, your fourth song, Peter, which is something in the bird world we don't want, but the sound of silence.
Well, this is definitely a hybrid choice, because Sound of Silence is a song that I have loved for a long, long time. Again, introduced to it by my parents, seems to be a consistent theme for the time being.
Yeah.
It was a song that was played a lot while we were going around, and so it holds meaning in that sense rather than drawing off the lyrics per se. And the Pentatonix cover, I love the original, and there are several other covers out there, but I have particular admiration for a cappella music, just because I'm not even remotely a musical person or really artistic in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that people can listen to a song that someone else has written and rearrange it and then replicate all those sounds just with their voices is just completely mind-blowing to me.
I know you've got a passion for bird photography as well as going out and looking for birds and taking people around and showing them great places that they can go to and find birds. You got your first camera, your first digital camera around 13. Was that the starting point for photography, or had you been interested in capturing animal life prior to that?
That was really the start of it, I'd have to say, because again, not being artistically gifted, I'd never tried drawing or illustrating anything from natural history. So having a camera was a really good opportunity for recording things. And it very much started off as something of a scientific undertaking, trying to get the field guide representation shot of the bird side on. And I'd have to confess, I haven't undertaken much artistic development since then, shall we say. I do still tend to aspire for the relatively boring, in inverted commas, efforts and images.
Okay, so while we're talking about photography, Peter, going back to the pelagics again, I remember you saying that, you can give birds on the horizon or a fair way away from the boat that scoot past at whatever, 40 or 50 kilometres an hour, and then you've got the other birds that are quite happy to come up close to the boat and maybe even sit on the water. If someone's going to go out and want to get pictures of these birds when they're out on a pelagic trip, what sort of gear do you recommend them to take as far as, trying to get the most out of what they're going to experience out there?
My first piece of advice, not being a particularly qualified advisor on photography matters in my own opinion, but my first thought would be take gear you're comfortable with using. There'll be opportunities to get photos of everything regardless of what you bring, because even if the birds are up close, the albatross, for example, there'll be times when there are some further away if you've got a long prime lens that you can't zoom out to get birds closer up. But when you're out on the boat, particularly if you're at any risk at all of feeling seasick, looking down and fiddling with buttons and screens is something that totally sets me off, and I'm shot for the day if I start doing that. So having some gear that you're comfortable with operating and familiar with really helps. I run with a 150 to 600 millimeter zoom lens, which, if that's a piece of gear that you've got something along the lines of, is really helpful, because it does give you the flexibility as birds are coming and going from the boat. You can catch those dots in the distance or an albatross right on the water without having to switch cameras or lenses or settle for cropping in later on a distant shot / only having close-ups of your albatrosses.
Mhm.
But if you really were in the position of going, you've got 2 prime lenses, one's a 600-800 mm and one's a 50 to a really short focal length type lens. My feeling would always be to plump for the longer lens, because then you do have a chance at the smaller things, and when larger birds or closer in species are further away, you'll get your chance with them then. The trade-off is looking down a long lens on a moving boat through a camera can be really challenging to track things.
Yeah.
But either way, I think certainly when I first started pelagic photography, it was foreign no matter what lens I was using. Trying to keep birds even in the field of view down the viewfinder was an impossibility. And I experimented with a 50mm lens, a 300mm, a 500 that I had at the time. It was just a matter of practice, really, and getting used to the motion of the boat and how that relates to what the birds are doing. So easy advice for a pelagic tragic like myself, but if you're really dead set on seabird photos, come on a good few pelagics. You get the opportunities, but you also get to the point where you're able to take all of those to full effect.
Right. Okay, good. Sounds like good advice. Okay, your last song, Peter. I'll get you to introduce it if you don't mind, because I know I'm gonna stuff the name up.
I won't subject to you to that. I won't put you through that pain. The last pick is a song that's very close to home, 𝗂𝗂𝗶𝗵𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃. It's a Maori song from New Zealand, and it's a song that the track you've got is sung by a fantastic New Zealand singer. I love Hayley Westenra's voice, but this is one of the songs that Mum used to sing me off to sleep with every night, and with a rendition like this one, I've just stuck with it.
You've finished your honours. I know you're going to be doing your PhD. What's your career path? I'm interested in, you've studied law and zoology and politics and geography, and you've got a fair gambit of academic background there. What's the future hold for Peter Vaughan as far as your path?
That is a very, very good question. On my current trajectory, academia is really fascinating. I mean, as you so astutely identified, I do really love knowing the whys and wherefores of bird watching and birds and what's going on. So the research side of academia really strongly appeals, but also I do greatly enjoy teaching, and I've done that for a number of years through the uni and through karate coaching as well. And academia seems like a sort of a perfect combination of those two interests as professions. But equally, I really love guiding. I could see myself going down that path and making more of a career out of that. Or even, particularly at the start of the year, I passed a fairly significant karate grading, and am now qualified to run my own club if I wanted to, under the system that I'm a part of.
Okay.
And I may well be looking at doing that for a few years somewhere along the line as well, and running a club for a living.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like you've got lots of interests and options there, Peter. Great. Whatever you do, I wish you all the success.
Thank you very much. Whatever I do, there'll be birds.
Yes, exactly. Peter, it's been so wonderful having a chat this afternoon, and I really appreciate you allowing a couple of hours in your hectic schedule. And despite a few little technical problems, we've got a wonderful session I'm sure the listeners will enjoy.
Oh, no worries at all. Thank you so much for having me on.